Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most tender teachings the Buddha ever offered. It is called the Metta Sutta, a poem about kindness, and it was not written for scholars or monks in halls. It was written for people who were afraid. The story goes that a group of monks had traveled deep into a forest to meditate. But the forest was not peaceful. Strange sounds came from the trees at night. Shadows moved in ways that shadows should not move. The monks could not sleep. They could not sit still. And so they returned to the Buddha, and they said, "We cannot stay there." And instead of sending them somewhere safer, the Buddha gave them something to carry back with them. Not a weapon, not a charm, a poem about kindness so complete, so without boundary, that even the forest grew quiet around it. The monks returned to those same dark trees, and they sat with the poem inside them. And the night became gentle, and the shadows became still. Tonight, that poem is yours. You do not need to memorize it. You do not need to understand it. You only need to let it be here, the way the monks let it be there, in the forest, in the dark. Before we begin, I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Feel free to share in the comments below. And if these quiet stories help you find rest, a like or a subscribe means the world to this small channel. It helps others who cannot sleep find their way here too. Now, let us settle in together. There is nothing you need to do tonight. Nothing to memorize. Nothing to understand. Nothing to practice or remember or carry into tomorrow. These are simply stories, old and gentle and unhurried, offered the way someone might tell you a story before sleep. Not because there will be a test in the morning, but because stories have a way of softening the places inside us that have grown tight during the day. They loosen without pulling. They warm without burning. And they ask nothing of us except that we listen. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to receive what is offered here tonight. You do not need to believe anything or follow anything or change anything about who you are. You only need to be here, wherever here is for you, lying down perhaps, or sitting in some quiet corner of your world. The fact that you are here at all is already a kind of gentleness. You chose rest. You chose to slow down. That is already enough. The teachings we will explore tonight come from a poem about kindness that the Buddha offered more than 2,500 years ago. It speaks of a heart that is full, not full of knowledge or accomplishment or things to prove, but full of warmth. A warmth so simple that even a child could understand it, and so deep that even the wisest among us spend a lifetime learning how to return to it. We will not study this poem tonight. We will not analyze it or break it into parts. We will simply rest inside it, the way you might rest inside a room that someone has already made warm for you. So settle in now. Let your body find whatever position feels most natural. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, not because you are pushing it away, but because you are no longer holding it up. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the air fill you, and let it go. Take another. Feel the chest rise and fall, the belly soften, the shoulders drop just a little, and let it go. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. Let us begin with a question. Not a question you need to answer, just a question to carry, the way you might carry a smooth stone in your pocket. What does it mean for a heart to be restless? Not a broken heart, not a grieving heart. Just a heart that cannot seem to settle. A heart that keeps returning to the same conversation, the same worry, the same tight knot of something unfinished. You know this heart. We all do. It is the heart that lies awake at midnight, replaying what was said and what was not said, rehearsing tomorrow before tomorrow has arrived. And tonight, we begin there, not because restlessness is a problem to solve, but because kindness, real kindness, begins the moment we stop fighting what is already here. In a small town where the evening light came late and left early, there lived a woman who sewed clothes for a living. Her workshop was not much, a narrow room at the back of her house, with a single window that looked out onto a stone wall covered in moss, and a wooden table where the sewing machine sat like an old friend who had long stopped needing words. The floor was smooth stone, cool even in summer. The walls were whitewashed but yellowed with years, and a calendar hung near the door, in still turned to a month she had already forgotten. But the room smelled of cotton and thread, and the faint sweetness of machine oil, and there was a comfort in that smell, the comfort of something familiar, something that did not change. She worked most evenings by the light of a small oil lamp, because the overhead bulb flickered and hummed and made the room feel like a waiting room in a place she did not want to be. The lamp was better. It threw a warm circle on the table and left everything else in soft darkness, and she liked it that way. The world felt smaller in lamplight, more manageable. Her hands moved steadily, guiding fabric beneath the needle, the way a person guides a boat through water they have crossed 100 times. Not thinking, just knowing. But tonight, the needle had stopped. Her hands were still. The fabric lay half-finished across her lap, a sleeve disconnected from its shoulder, and she was staring at the wall without seeing it. In her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She was standing in her sister's kitchen 3 weeks ago, and the argument was happening again. The same words, the same rising voice, her own voice, sharper than she meant it to be. The same expression on her sister's face, which was not anger exactly, but something worse. Disappointment, maybe, or exhaustion. The look of someone who has stopped expecting things to be different. And then the silence afterward, which filled the kitchen like smoke. She had replayed this scene so many times that she could no longer tell which parts were memory and which parts she had added later. In the dark, alone with the sewing machine. Did her sister really say that one thing? Did she really respond that way? It did not matter anymore. The scene had become a creature of its own, and it visited her every evening. Usually around the time the lamp began to sputter, and it sat down beside her and made itself comfortable and stayed. There was a knock at the door, soft, almost apologetic. The kind of knock that says, "I am here if you want me, and I will leave if you do not." Her neighbor, an old woman who lived alone in the house next door, stood in the doorway holding a clay cup of tea. The cup was rough and unglazed, the kind made by hand in a village where no one was in a hurry, and the tea inside it smelled of ginger and dried lemongrass and something deeper, something earthy and warm, like soil after rain. "Come in," the seamstress said, though she did not feel like company. The old woman stepped inside, moving slowly, the way people move when they have learned that speed does not help. She sat down on the only other chair in the room, a wooden stool with a woven seat, and placed the tea on the table beside the sewing machine, next to a spool of white thread and a pair of scissors that caught the lamplight. She folded her hands in her lap, and she said nothing. For a long time, they sat in silence. The seamstress wanted to explain, wanted to say, "I am sorry. I am not good company tonight. My mind will not stop moving. I keep hearing the same conversation, and I cannot make it leave." But the old woman did not seem to expect conversation. She simply sat, her hands still, her breathing slow and even, the way a candle burns when there is no draught in the room. Her presence was not heavy. It was not light either. It was just there, the way the wall was there, the way the floor was there. After a while, the old woman spoke. "Can you hear the crickets?" she asked. The seamstress blinked. She had not heard anything except her own thoughts for hours. "Listen," the old woman said gently. "They have been singing all evening. Long before either of us sat down. They do not know we are here, and they do not care. They sing because that is what they do. And they had been." She could hear them now, a steady, layered chorus, rising and falling just beyond the window, where the moss grew on the stone wall. How long had they been there? All night, probably. All her life, probably. But she had not been listening. There had been no room for crickets. The argument had taken up all the space. "That is a strange thing about noise," the old woman said. "The loudest noise is usually the one inside us, and it is so loud that it drowns out everything else. The crickets, the wind, the sound of our own breathing, even the sound of someone knocking at the door. We think the world is noisy, but often the world is very quiet. It is we who are loud." The seamstress looked at the tea. The surface was perfectly still, a small dark mirror reflecting the flame of the lamp. "How do you make it stop?" she asked. "You do not make it stop," the old woman said. "That is not how it works. You do not chase the noise away. You make room for something else." A wise teacher once said that when the mind is compassionate, it becomes boundless. Not empty, boundless. There is a difference. An empty room has nothing in it. A boundless room has space for everything. The argument and the regret and the crickets and the tea and the sound of your own breathing. You do not throw anything out. You just stop pretending the room is too small. The seamstress did not fully understand, but she picked up the tea and drank it. It was warm, and the ginger burned softly at the back of her throat, and the lemongrass left something clean on her tongue. And for a moment, just a moment, the argument in her head was not the only thing in the room. There was also the tea, and the lamp, and the crickets, and the warmth of another person sitting close enough to touch. The old woman left a few minutes later, without saying goodbye. She did not need to. The door closed softly behind her, and her footsteps faded on the stone path, and the room was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. A quieter quiet. The lamp still flickered. The fabric still lay unfinished, the sleeve still waiting for its shoulder. But the seamstress sat for a while longer, listening to the crickets, and the tea cooled in her hands, and the light from the oil lamp reflected off the inside of the empty clay cup like a small, steady moon that had found its way indoors. Tonight, if you are lying here with a mind that will not stop, replaying conversations that ended days ago, rehearsing tomorrow's difficulties before they have arrived, reviewing the long list of things you meant to do and did not, you are not broken. You are not doing something wrong. You are simply human, and humans have minds that move. That is what minds do. They reach and grasp and circle back and reach again, like hands searching for something in the dark. The Buddha once observed that hatred does not cease by hatred. It ceases only by love. This is an ancient and eternal law, and perhaps the same is true of restlessness. It does not cease by force. You cannot quiet the mind by shouting at it to be quiet. It softens when something warmer enters the room, the way that old woman entered the seamstress's workshop. Not with answers, not with instructions, not with a 5-step plan for inner peace, just with presence, just with tea, just with the gentle suggestion to listen for the crickets. You do not need to fix the restlessness inside you. You only need to stop being alone with it. And tonight, you are not alone with it. You are here. And these stories are here. And the night is here, holding all of it. And there is another story I would like to share with you. This one about a different kind of stillness. A stillness that was hard-earned and often lost and always worth returning to. High on a hill where the bamboo grew thick and the wind never fully stopped, there lived a monk who had been practicing meditation for more years than most people stay in one house. His hermitage was small, 3 walls and a sliding screen that faced east, so the first light of morning would find him already sitting. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by decades of the same knees, in the same position, and the walls were rough wood that still smelled faintly of the forest it had come from. A single cushion sat in the center of the room, flattened in the middle from years of use, and beside it, a clay bowl for water and a cloth for wiping the dust that the wind carried in through the open door. On this particular morning, the air was cold and damp. Mist clung to the bamboo like a second skin, and when the wind moved through the grove, the stalks creaked and leaned and whispered against each other in a sound that was not quite music and not quite language, but something in between. Dew had gathered on the monk's eyebrows and on the fine hairs of his forearms. He could feel each tiny drop, precise and patient, like small cool fingers pressing gently against his skin. The earth beneath his knees was soft from last night's rain, and the smell that rose from it was old and clean and alive, the way soil smells when it has been holding water all night and is finally ready to let it go. He had sat through many mornings like this one, thousands, perhaps, and on most of them, the mind grew still without effort, settling like sediment in a glass of water that no one is stirring. But this morning, the mind was not still. It circled and returned, like a dog walking around and around a spot on the floor, unable to lie down. There was no particular thought driving it, no worry, no memory, no plan, just movement. Just the restless hum of a mind that had forgotten, for the moment, how to stop. He noticed this. He noticed it the way a person notices a change in the weather, without judgment, without urgency. And then he noticed something else. He was annoyed, not at the thought, at himself, at the fact that after all these years, after all these mornings, after all this silence and all this practice, the mind still wandered, still fidgeted, still refused on some mornings to do the one thing he had spent his life learning to help it do. And in that noticing, something shifted, because the annoyance was itself another layer, another noise on top of the noise. He was being unkind to his own mind. He was treating it the way a frustrated parent treats a child who will not sleep, with impatience, with the unspoken message that hums beneath every sharp sigh. You should be better than this by now. You should know how to do this. What is wrong with you? He breathed. And then he did something very simple. He did not push the restlessness away. He did not try harder. He did not reach for a technique or a teaching or a memory of a better morning. He simply offered kindness to the restless mind, not as a strategy, not as a method, just as a response. The way you might look at a child who is crying at 2 in the morning, and instead of saying, "Stop," you say, I know, it is hard. Come here." The mind did not suddenly grow silent. It still moved. But it moved differently now. Not like a dog circling the floor, but like a river moving through a valley it has known for a long time. And the monk sat with it, and the bamboo creaked in the wind, and a single bird called out from somewhere, deep in the mist, one clear, high note, rising. And the light came slowly, slowly, through the open screen, turning the mist from grey to pale gold. And the dew on his eyebrows caught the first light and held it there, like something precious that the morning had offered without being asked. He did not need the mind to be silent. He only needed to stop being at war with it. And that, he realized, was the oldest lesson, the one he had learned first and forgotten most often. Kindness does not begin with others. It begins with whatever is nearest. And nothing is nearer than your own restless, stubborn, beautiful, endlessly searching mind. There is a river that flows at the edge of a wide valley, and in that river there are many stones. Some are large and jagged, with edges that break the current into white foam. Some are small and smooth and warm from the afternoon sun. Some lying just beneath the surface where the water runs clear and slow. The river does not choose which stones to flow around. It does not prefer the smooth ones. It does not resent the jagged ones. It does not pause before the difficult stone and think, this one does not deserve my patience. It meets each one the same way, with softness, with persistence, with a willingness to go around what it cannot go through. No one taught the river to do this. No one sat beside it and said, this is how you should behave. It simply flows. And in the flowing, over years, over centuries, the stones are changed. The jagged edges become round. The rough surfaces become smooth, not by force, not by argument, not by one single dramatic moment, by contact, by time, by the quiet, unhurried insistence of water that does not stop and does not need to be thanked. Perhaps kindness is like that. Not a decision you make once, not a discipline you press on a schedule, just a way of flowing through the world that changes everything it touches, including the one who is flowing. And perhaps, as you hear this, your attention has already begun to soften, without you asking it to. Perhaps the conversation you were replaying has lost a little of its sharpness. Not gone, just quieter, the way a sound grows quieter when you have turned your head towards something else. Perhaps the list of tomorrow's worries has moved slightly further from the center of your mind, not erased, just further away. The way sounds move further when you are beginning to drift towards sleep. This is not something you are doing. This is something that happens when the room inside you grows a little bigger. When there is space, not just for the worry, but also for the crickets. Not just for the argument, but also for the warmth of a cup of tea you did not ask for. Not just for the restless mind, but also for the kindness of noticing that it is restless, and letting it be restless, and not needing it to be anything else. Sharon Salzberg, one of the great modern teachers of this ancient practice, once wrote that the difference between misery and happiness depends on what we do with our attention. Not what we think, not what we feel, what we attend to. And right now, in this moment, you are attending to a story, a voice, the weight of your own body against whatever is holding you, the rhythm of your own breathing, which continues whether you notice it or not. That is attention turned towards something gentle. And that gentle attention has a name. In the old language, in Pali, the language the Buddha spoke, it is called metta. The word comes from mita, which simply means friend, not romantic love, not charity, not obligation, not something you have to earn or something you give because you should. Just the quiet, steady, uncomplicated wish that someone, including yourself, be well, be safe, be at ease, the way a friend wishes these things for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, just as a matter of course, as a way of being. You do not need to remember that word, but if it stays with you, let it stay the way a warm stone stays in a pocket. Something you can reach for without thinking about it. Something that was there before you noticed it, and will be there after you forget. And when you are ready, we will continue together. There is someone you may have forgotten to be kind to. Someone very close, perhaps the closest person of all. There is someone you may have forgotten to be kind to. Someone who has been with you through every difficult morning and every sleepless night. Someone who has carried you through days when carrying felt impossible. And yet, when the day is done, when the lists are finished, and the doors are locked, and the lights are turned off, this person is often the last one you think to be gentle with. That person is you. Let us rest here for a moment before we go further. Let the stories we have already shared settle into whatever place feels right. And when you are ready, we will continue together. In a town where the restaurants closed early and the streets grew quiet by 9, there was a woman who cooked for a living. She ran a small place, 8 tables, a kitchen no bigger than a bedroom, and a menu that changed with what was fresh at the market that morning. She was the only cook. She was also the one who wiped down the counters at the end of the night and swept the floor and locked the door and walked home alone through streets that smelled of rain and exhaust and the last traces of garlic from her own kitchen clinging to her hair. The kitchen itself was a narrow, bright, relentless place. The stove had 4 burners, and all 4 were usually going at once during the evening rush. Steam rose from pots and collected on the ceiling tiles, which had turned a permanent shade of yellow from years of heat and oil and hurry. The overhead light was a long fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered. Not enough to go dark, just enough to make the light feel uncertain, as if it too were tired and thinking about quitting. Her hands were burned in places she had stopped noticing. The inside of her left wrist had a scar from a pot handle that had been hotter than she expected 3 years ago, or maybe 4. She did not remember the exact day. She remembered the sound she made. A sharp breath inward, the hiss of skin meeting metal. And then the way she had kept cooking, because there were orders and the food did not care that her wrist was burning. That was how she lived. There were always orders. There was always someone waiting. Her husband, before he left, used to say that she gave everything to the kitchen and brought home only the tiredness. He was not entirely wrong. Her children, grown now, called on Sundays, and she always said she was fine. And she always meant it in the way that people mean it when they have stopped asking themselves whether it is actually true. Tonight, the last customer had left over an hour ago. The chairs were stacked on the tables, the floor was swept, and she was standing at the stove alone, staring at a pot of soup that had burned. It was not a complicated soup. It was the one she made every Tuesday, a simple broth with vegetables and white beans, the kind of soup that required almost no thought, which was perhaps why she had stopped paying attention. She had been thinking about her daughter's phone call, about the tone in her daughter's voice, about whether she had said the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether the difference between the two was smaller than she feared. And while she was thinking, the soup had burned. The bottom of the pot was black. The kitchen smelled of scorched beans and something acrid and bitter and the smoke had triggered the small fan above the stove, which whirred and rattled like an insect trapped in a jar. She turned off the burner. She looked at the pot. And then, for reasons she could not fully explain, she sat down on the kitchen floor. Not gracefully, not deliberately. She just sat down, the way a person sits down when their legs decide, without consulting the rest of the body, that standing is no longer an option. The floor was cold tile. She could feel it through her thin cotton pants. A shock of coolness against the backs of her thighs that was almost pleasant after the hours of heat. The faucet at the sink was dripping. She had meant to fix it for weeks. Each drop made a small, precise sound, like a clock that was keeping time for no one. And sitting there, on the cold tile, with the burnt pot still smoking above her, and the fluorescent light flickering its uncertain rhythm, she began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears, rolling down her face the way rain rolls down a window, slowly following the path of least resistance. She was not crying about the soup. She was crying because she had just realized something that should not have been a revelation, but was. In all the years of cooking for others, for her husband, for her children, for the customers who came and went and rarely learned her name, she had never once burned a meal and said to herself, "It is all right, you are tired, it does not matter." In all the years of caring for everyone around her, she had never once turned that care inward, never once looked at her own exhaustion and said, "I see you, I know, you have done enough." She had heard a teaching once, years ago, from a woman at a community center who spoke about meditation. She did not remember most of it, but she remembered one line that the woman had attributed to the Buddha, or perhaps to a student of the Buddha. She was not sure. The line was this: "You can search throughout the entire universe for someone who is more deserving of your love and affection than you are yourself. And that person is not to be found anywhere." She had thought it was a nice thing to say. She had not thought it was for her. But now, sitting on the floor of her own kitchen, she thought perhaps it was. Perhaps it had always been. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and the hand smelled of garlic and burnt beans, and she did not get up. Not yet. She just sat there for a while, letting the faucet drip and the fan rattle and the fluorescent light make up its mind about whether to stay on or not. And the pot above her cooled, and the smoke thinned, and the light finally steadied, and the kitchen was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in years. There is a teaching that sits at the very heart of what the Buddha called the path of kindness, and it is this: compassion for others begins with kindness to ourselves, not as a luxury, not as a reward for having first been kind to everyone else, as a foundation. The way the floor of a house must be solid before anything can be built upon it. The way the roots of a tree must reach deep before the branches can reach wide. Pema Chodron, the American Buddhist teacher who has spent decades helping people find their way through difficult times, once put it simply. She said, "Compassion for others begins with kindness to ourselves. Without loving kindness for ourselves, it is difficult, if not impossible, to genuinely feel it for others. This is not selfishness. Selfishness hoards, it takes and keeps and closes the door. Self-compassion is the opposite. It opens. It fills the cup so that there is something to pour. It says, before you go out into the world and try to love it, sit down for a moment. Sit down on the cold floor if you need to. And let someone be kind to you, even if that someone is yourself. You cannot pour from a cup that is empty." You have heard this before perhaps, and perhaps It sounded like a greeting card. But tonight, lying here in the dark, it may sound different. Because you know what it feels like to be empty. You know what it feels like to have given all day. Your attention, your patience, your words, your worry. And to arrive at night with nothing left. And still, even then, to lie here thinking about what you should have done better. There is an old story from the Zen tradition about a scholar who visited a master to learn about enlightenment. The master offered tea. He poured the visitor's cup full and then kept pouring. The tea spilled over the rim, across the table, onto the floor. The scholar said, "Stop, the cup is full, no more will fit." And the master said, "Yes, you are like this cup. You come full of your own opinions and expectations. How can I show you anything until you first empty your cup?" This story is usually told as a lesson about humility, about emptying the mind so it can receive. But tonight, let us hear it differently. Think of the cup not as your mind, but as your heart. And think of the tea not as knowledge, but as kindness. If your heart is already full of obligations, full of guilt, full of the belief that you must always be doing more, then there is no room for the simplest kindness of all, the kindness of saying, "Enough, I have done enough today. I am enough tonight." Who fills the cup for you? Who pours the tea when you are the one who has been pouring all day? The Zen master's answer, if he were here tonight, might be very quiet. He might simply point at you and say nothing at all. In a town where the houses backed up against farmland, and the nearest neighbor was a 5-minute walk through tall grass, there lived a man who kept a garden. He was old, not ancient, but old enough that his knees spoke to him in the morning, and his back had opinions about the weather. He had been a soldier once, a long time ago, in a war that people still argued about at dinner tables he no longer sat at. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about much. He had come home from it with a body that still worked, and a way of holding himself that made other people stand a little straighter, and a silence inside him that he had mistaken for discipline for most of his life. The garden was in the back of his house, behind a wooden fence he had built himself, from planks that did not quite match. It was not a large garden, 4 raised beds, a row of herbs along the south side, and a small patch of wildflowers that his wife had planted before she died, and that he maintained now with a tenderness he would have found embarrassing if anyone had been watching. The soil was dark and rich. He turned it by hand every spring, working slowly, kneeling on an old towel because the ground was harder than it used to be, or his knees were softer, or both. Today the light was coming in, long and golden, through the slats of the fence, the way light comes in late afternoon, when the sun has given up its ambition and is simply resting on its way down. The mint along the south bed had grown past its borders again, and the smell of it rose every time his hand brushed the leaves, sharp and clean and immediate, cutting through the heavier smell of earth and compost, and the faint sweetness of the roses near the fence. Somewhere behind the house, a cicada was singing its long, single note, the sound of late summer winding down. He was kneeling beside a rose bush, examining a branch that had bent under its own weight. The flowers were deep red, almost black at the center, and the petals were beginning to open in that slow, deliberate way that roses have, as if they are deciding, one petal at a time, whether the world deserves to see what is inside. He cupped the bent branch in his palm and lifted it gently, the way you might lift the chin of a child who is looking at the ground. His hands were rough, thick-knuckled, scarred across the backs. the hands of someone who had spent decades gripping things that required force. A rifle, a wrench, a steering wheel on icy roads. But here, holding the rose, the hands were something else entirely. Here, they were careful. Here, they were slow. Here, they knew exactly how much pressure was too much. And it struck him, kneeling there in the late golden light, with dirt under his fingernails and the cicada singing its one relentless note, that he had never once treated himself the way he treated this garden. He had never once knelt beside his own tiredness and said, "Let me see what is bent. Let me lift it gently." He had never watered his own dry places with the same patience he gave to the mint and the roses and the wild flowers his wife had loved. He had spent his whole life being hard on himself, pushing through, enduring, standing straight when everything inside him wanted to fold. And he had called that strength. He had called it discipline. He had called it being a man. But the garden did not grow because he was hard on it. The garden grew because he was gentle with it, because he waited, because he gave it water and light and time, and did not stand over it, demanding that it bloom faster. The roses did not respond to orders. They responded to care. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Vietnamese Zen master, once said that no one is more worthy of your kindness and compassion than you are. The old gardener had never heard of Thich Nhat Hanh. He did not know the word metta or the word compassion in any language other than his own. But kneeling there, lifting the bent rose with hands that had finally learned to be gentle, he understood the teaching as well as anyone who had ever sat in a meditation hall. He understood it in his knees and his palms of his back and the place behind his ribs where something had been tight for 40 years and was now, for the first time, beginning to loosen. He did not stand up right away. He stayed kneeling in the dirt for a while, holding the branch, letting the light come through the fence and fall across his shoulders like a hand. The cicada sang, the mint smelled sharp and green, and somewhere inside him, in a room he had kept locked for a very long time, a door opened, not dramatically, not with a crash, but the way a door opens when the wind finds it unlatched, quietly, naturally, as if it had been waiting. Tonight, if you are lying here carrying the weight of everything you think you should have done better, every mistake replayed, every sharp word you wish you could take back, every moment you fell short of the person you believe you are supposed to be, I want you to consider something. What if you treated yourself tonight the way that old man treated his garden? Not with force, not with expectation, just with patience, just with care, just with the quiet understanding that growing takes time, and bending is not the same as breaking. Pema Chodron wrote something that has stayed with many people who have heard it. She said, "Be kinder to yourself, and then let your kindness flood the world." Not the other way around. Not be kind to the world and hope that someday there is enough left over for you. Start here. Start with whatever part of yourself feels most tired tonight. Start with the shoulders that have been holding something up all day. And perhaps you notice them now. Perhaps you notice that they have been lifted, just slightly, just enough to create a tension you had stopped feeling because it has been there so long. You do not need to force them down. You do not need to do anything at all. Just notice. That is enough. The noticing itself is a form of kindness. The attention itself is care. There is a word for this in the old language. It is karuna, where metta is the wish that someone be happy. Karuna is the response to suffering, the heart that sees pain and moves toward it instead of away. When you turn that response inward, When you see your own exhaustion, your own loneliness, your own quiet disappointment with yourself, and instead of looking away, you stay. That is karuna directed at the one person who needs it most tonight. You do not need to remember the word. Just remember the feeling of staying, of not turning away from yourself, of sitting on the kitchen floor or kneeling in the garden and saying, I am here, I am not going anywhere, and it is all right. It is all right. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is something heavier than sadness that many of us carry without knowing its name. It is not grief, it is not anger exactly. It is the weight of holding on to someone else's wrong. And tonight, we will set that weight down, gently, the way you set down something you have been carrying for so long that your arms have forgotten what it feels like to be empty. There is something heavier than sadness that many of us carry without knowing its name. It is not grief. Grief has a shape, a season, a direction. It is not anger exactly. Anger flares and fades and flares again. This is quieter than anger, more patient. It is the weight of holding on to someone else's wrong, not as a memory but as a companion. Something you wake up with, something you carry through the day, the way you carry your keys. Always there, always in your pocket, so familiar that you no longer notice the weight until someone asks what is pulling your coat to one side. Tonight, let us look at that weight, not to judge it, not to force it down, just to notice it, and perhaps, by the end of this next part of our journey, to set it down. Gently, the way you set down something fragile that you have been holding too tightly for too long on a stretch of coastline, where the rocks jutted out into the sea like the knuckles of a half-buried hand. There lived a man who had fished these waters for most of his life. He was old now, old enough that his body had begun to argue with the work, old enough that the cold mornings left marks on his joints that did not fully disappear by noon. But he still went out every morning. Before the light had fully committed to the sky, he walked down the stone path to the water's edge, his boots scraping against the wet rock, in a rhythm he could have followed, with his eyes closed. The sea at that hour was not the sea of postcards. It was grey and muscular and restless, heaving against the rocks with a sound that was not quite a crash and not quite a sigh, but something between. The sound of something immense and patient repeating itself without expectation. The air tasted of salt and iron, and on cold mornings like this one, the mist rose from the surface and hung over the water like a second sky, low and white, and close enough to touch. His hands, even inside the gloves, were stiff. The damp had a way of finding every seam, every gap, every place where the leather had worn thin, and the cold settled into his fingers like an old debt that would not be paid off. He kept his boat in a small cove on the south side of the headland. He had always fished the south side. There was good water to the north as well. Better water, some said, with deeper channels and larger fish. But he had not gone north in 20 years. Not since the trouble with his partner. They had fished together for a decade. He and the other man shared a boat, shared the catch, shared the long silences that come between people who work side by side in weather that does not care about their opinions. They were not friends exactly. They were something else, something that does not have a word in most languages. They were people who trusted each other with ropes and tides, and the particular danger of deep water, which is a kind of trust that goes deeper than friendship. And then, one autumn, the other man had done something with the money. The details had blurred with time. There were accounts and percentages, and A meeting in a small office where someone in a tie explained what had happened. But the feeling had not blurred at all. The feeling was sharp and specific, and it lived in a very particular place in his chest, just below the collarbone, like a fish hook that had set itself and could not be backed out without tearing something. 20 years. He had not spoken to the man in 20 years. He had not fished the north side in 20 years. And every morning, walking down to the cove in the dark, he passed the path that led north. And every morning something tightened in that place below his collarbone. And every morning, he turned south without looking. His grandson came with him sometimes, a young man, 19, maybe 20, with quick hands and the kind of easy silence that the old fisherman recognized as something inherited, passed down through the blood like eye color or the shape of a jaw. The boy did not talk much, which was good, but he noticed things which were sometimes less good. "Grandfather," the boy said, as they hauled the nets from the stern, "why do we never fish the North Channel?" The old man pulled at the net. The mesh was heavy with water and weed, and the weight of things that had not yet shown their shape. "Because I know the South," he said. The boy was quiet for a moment, coiling rope. "But everyone says the North is better, deeper, more fish. You could." "I know what everyone says." Silence, the sound of water against the hull, the creak of the boat shifting on its anchor. "Is it because of him?" the boy asked. "The man you used to fish with." The old fisherman stopped pulling. His hands were still on the net. The mist was beginning to thin, and somewhere above them, a gull cried once and then was silent. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He took something from me, and I have been carrying that every morning for 20 years. Every morning I walk past that path, and I feel it again. And I tell myself it is the principle of the thing, that some wrongs should not be forgiven. That forgetting would be the same as saying it was all right." The boy looked at him. His eyes were calm and clear, the eyes of someone who had not yet learned to carry things. "But you are the one carrying it," he said. "Not him. You told me once that holding on to anger is like picking up a hot coal to throw at someone. You are the one who gets burned." "Do you remember saying that?" The old man did not answer. He turned back to the net and pulled, and the net came up heavy, and in the tangle of weed and water and caught things, there was a fish, not large, not small, wrapped so tightly in a knot of seaweed that it could not move. Its gills worked rapidly, opening and closing, opening and closing. It was not injured. Nothing had pierced it or cut it. It was simply held, bound by something that had no intention of holding it. The seaweed did not know. The fish was there, did not care, was not trying to trap anything. It was just weed, doing what weed does, and the fish was caught in it anyway. The old man reached into the net with his bare hands. The gloves were too thick for this kind of work, and began to pull the weed away, strand by strand, gently, so as not to tear the skin. His fingers were cold and clumsy, but they were patient, and when the last strand came free, the fish hung in his palm for a moment, slick and alive and breathing hard, and then he lowered his hand over the side, and the fish slipped into the dark water and was gone. He looked at his hands. They were wet and cold, and smelled of salt and seaweed. He looked out, across the water, toward the north side of the headland, where the mist was thinning, and the rocks were beginning to show their dark shapes against the lighter grey of the sky. He had not looked that way, really looked, not just glanced, in 20 years. The fish did not need to be rescued, he said, almost to himself. It just needed the weed pulled away. The boy said nothing. He coiled the rope and waited. Tonight, if there is someone whose name still tightens something in your chest, someone whose voice you can still hear in your quietest moments, someone whose wrong you have carried so long that it has become part of the landscape of your days, you are not wrong to feel what you feel. The hurt was real. What happened, happened. Forgiveness does not mean pretending it did not. But Pema Chodron, who has walked with many people through this very place, once offered this observation: we can let the circumstances of our lives harden us so that we become increasingly resentful and afraid, or we can let them soften us and make us kinder and more open to what scares us. We always have this choice. The choice is not to forget. The choice is what to do with the carrying, whether to keep walking south every morning, past the path that leads to the rest of your life, or to stop and look north and see what is there, now, today, after all this time. In a house at the end of a narrow street, where the pavement gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to weeds, there lived a woman who had once been a teacher. She had taught children to read for 37 years. First in a bright classroom with tall windows, then in a smaller room with fluorescent lights, and finally in a portable building behind the school that smelled of chalk dust and rain. She had retired 5 years ago, and the house was quiet now in a way that sometimes felt like peace and sometimes felt like something else. It was raining this afternoon, not hard, a steady, patient rain, the kind that has no interest in stopping and no interest in hurrying. It tapped on the tin roof above her bedroom with a sound she had known her whole life, a sound that was supposed to be comforting. But today was not, because today she was sitting at her desk by the window, staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to write a letter she had been trying to write for 3 years. The desk was old, oak, heavy, the kind of desk that does not move once you put it somewhere. She had bought it when her daughter was born, thinking she would use it to grade papers at home, and she had for years and years, leaning over student work by the light of a brass lamp that threw a circle of warm gold across the surface and left the rest of the room in shadow. The lamp was still there. The brass had darkened with age. The light was the same. On the desk, beside the blank paper, there was a fountain pen she had owned for decades. The ink was blue-black, the color of deep water, and it bled slightly on cheap paper, but held its line on good paper. And the paper she had chosen today was good paper, heavy and smooth, taken from a box she kept in the bottom drawer for occasions that never seemed to arrive. Her daughter had not spoken to her in 4 years. The reasons were complicated and simple at the same time, the way family reasons always are. A disagreement that grew into a silence that grew into a wall that grew so tall that neither of them could see over it anymore. And after a while, they stopped trying. The teacher had tried to forgive. She had said the words to herself in the mirror, in the car, in the quiet minutes before sleep. I forgive her. I forgive her. But the words rang hollow, like coins dropped into an empty well. Forgiveness, she had discovered, does not come because you decide it should. It comes, or it does not, and the deciding has very little to do with it. So, today, she was not trying to forgive. She was just trying to write. She picked up the pen. The nib touched the paper, and the ink left a small dot, a period before the sentence had begun. And then she wrote, not to her daughter exactly, not to anyone exactly. She wrote to the space between them. She wrote to the silence. She wrote about the day her daughter was born. The weight of her, the warmth, the way her fingers had curled around the teacher's thumb with a grip that seemed impossible for something so small. She wrote about the first day of school and the lunchbox with the dented corner and the drawing of a horse that had hung on the refrigerator for 2 years because neither of them could bear to take it down. She wrote about the argument, not to rehash it, but to set it down on the paper, the way you might set a heavy stone on a table, just to feel what your arms are like without it. And with each line something shifted. Not in the room. The rain still fell. The clock still ticked its patient rhythm on the wall. The light from the brass lamp still held its circle on the desk. But in her, in the place behind her ribs, where the knot had lived for 4 years, Sharon Salzberg once wrote that to relinquish the futile effort to control change is one of the strengthening forces of true love. The teacher did not know this quote, but she knew the feeling of it, the feeling of stopping, of letting the pen do what the heart could not, of writing not to send but to release. She finished the letter. She read it once, then she folded it carefully, once, twice, 3 times, and placed it in the desk drawer beside the box of good paper. She did not seal it. She did not address it. She did not need to. The letter was not for her daughter. The letter was for herself. It was permission to set the stone down, permission to stop carrying someone else's wrong, not because the wrong was not real, but because the carrying had become heavier than the wrong itself. The rain softened. The clock on the wall continued its work, but it sounded different now, slower, somehow, or perhaps she was simply hearing it differently. The light from the lamp caught the edge of the fountain pen, and the blue-black ink on the nib gleamed like a small dark jewel. She sat for a while, her hands empty, her lap empty, the desk clear except for the lamp and the pen and the quiet. And outside the window, the rain fell on everything equally, on the gravel and the weeds and the roof and the street and the house. At the end of it, where a woman had just put something down that she had been holding for a very long time. There is an old story, told in many versions across many traditions, about 2 monks walking together along a muddy road. They came to a river crossing where a young woman stood at the water's edge, unable to cross. The current was strong, and the water was high, and her clothes were not made for wading. Without a word, the older monk lifted her onto his back, carried her across the river, set her down on the far bank, and continued walking. The younger monk said nothing for an hour, 2 hours, 3. The road dried, the sun moved, and finally, unable to hold it any longer, the younger monk burst out. "How could you do that? We have taken vows. We are not supposed to touch a woman. You carried her on your back. How could you do that?" The older monk turned and looked at him with eyes that were neither angry nor amused, but simply present. "I set her down at the river," he said. "Why are you still carrying her? This is what resentment does. It keeps carrying something that has already been set down in the world. Set down by time, by distance, by the simple fact that the moment is over." The river was crossed. The woman walked away. The afternoon continued, but in the younger monk's mind, the woman was still on the older monk's back, and the crossing was still happening, and the vow was still being broken, again and again and again, with every step. What are you still carrying that the world has already set down? What river did you cross years ago that your mind is still crossing tonight? You do not need to answer. Just notice the way the old fisherman noticed the seaweed, the way the teacher noticed her empty hands, And perhaps you can notice your own hands right now, wherever they are, resting on your chest, lying beside you, curled loosely on the blanket. Are they holding anything? Not physically, but inside. Is there a grip you have been maintaining without knowing it? A tightness in the fingers, a tension in the palms, the muscular memory of holding on. You do not need to open them. You do not need to do anything at all. Just notice whether they are open or closed. That is enough. The noticing is enough. There is a word in Pali, the old language of the Buddha, for this kind of holding on. It is upadana. It means clinging, not the clinging of a child to a parent, which is natural and warm, but the clinging of a hand to a coal, the refusal to let go of something that is already burning you. The Buddha observed that much of our suffering comes not from what happened to us, but from our refusal to set it down. Upadana is the seaweed around the fish, the letter unwritten in the drawer, the north side of the headland you have not looked at in 20 years. To let go of upadana is not to forget. It is not to say that what happened was acceptable. It is simply to stop feeding it, to stop walking past the same path every morning and tightening, to stop replaying the scene and adding new lines, to let the letter be written and folded and placed in the drawer, and to feel what your hands are like when they are finally empty. When you are ready, we will continue together. And perhaps kindness does not need to be large at all. Perhaps it lives in places so small that most of us walk past it every day without seeing it, without knowing that the most ordinary moments of our lives are already full of it. And perhaps kindness does not need to be large at all. Perhaps it does not require a grand gesture, or a difficult sacrifice, or a moment of extraordinary courage. Perhaps it has been here all along, in places so small and so ordinary that most of us walk past it every day without noticing, without naming it, without understanding that the simplest moments of our lives are already full of something the Buddha spent a lifetime trying to describe. Think about this. Think about the small kindnesses that move through a single day without being recognized. Someone holds a door open for a stranger and does not think about it afterward. A person on a bus shifts slightly to make room, and the shifting is so natural, so automatic, that neither person registers it as anything at all. A neighbor waves from across the street, not because there is anything to say, but simply because you are there and they are there. And the morning is the kind of morning that seems to ask for a wave. A cashier smiles at the end of a long line. A stranger bends down to pick up something you dropped. A child, too young to know the word generosity, hands you a cracker from a box she has been guarding with both arms. None of these make the news. None of them change the world in any way that can be measured or counted or put into a report. And yet, without them, the world would be a colder place. Without them, we would move through our days like stones rolling downhill, fast and hard, and touching nothing softly. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Zen master who spent his life teaching people how to live with more awareness, once observed that the most lovable quality anyone can possess is kindness. Not brilliance, not beauty, not success. Kindness. And perhaps the reason we overlook it is precisely because it is so ordinary. We are trained to look for the extraordinary. We celebrate the dramatic rescue, the grand donation, the life-changing decision. But kindness, real, daily, unremarkable kindness, does not announce itself. It is more like rain. It falls where it falls. It does not choose. There is a small pond at the edge of a meadow, the kind of pond that does not appear on any map, that exists only for the frogs and the dragonflies, and the occasional deer that comes to drink at dusk. On a still afternoon, when the air is warm and nothing is moving, a single raindrop falls from a cloud that has already passed. It strikes the surface of the pond, one drop, no larger than a fingertip, and the water responds. A circle forms, small at first, tight and precise, the way a bell sounds when it is first struck, and then it expands, wider, wider, touching the reeds at the edge, touching the mud where the deer stood this morning, reaching the far side of the pond, where a frog sits on a stone and feels, without understanding, a ripple that began with something too small to see. The raindrop did not intend this. It did not plan the ripple. It simply fell, and the water did the rest. Perhaps kindness works the same way. You do not need to plan the ripple. You do not need to calculate the reach. You only need to fall. Gently, honestly, without expectation. And the world opens around you in circles you will never fully see. In a grocery store at the edge of a town that was neither large nor small, a young woman stood behind a register and scanned items for a living. She had been doing this for 14 months. She knew the beep of the scanner, the way a musician knows the tuning note. It was always the same pitch, the same flat electronic tone. Whether it was scanning a can of soup, or a birthday cake, or a bottle of medicine someone needed to get through the week, the sound did not change. The items changed, the people changed. But the sound was always the same. The store was bright in the way that grocery stores are bright. A fluorescent, shadowless brightness that flattened everything and made the hours feel longer than they were. The light had no warmth in it. It did not shift with the time of day. At 8 in the morning and 8 at night, the store looked exactly the same. And this sameness had begun to feel like a kind of erasure, as if the hours she spent here did not fully count as hours, as if time moved differently under these lights than it did outside, where the sky changed color and the shadows told you where you were in the day. The air smelled of bread from the bakery section, a warm, yeasty, golden smell that drifted through the aisles and settled over the registers like a kind of apology for the fluorescent lights. Behind her, a speaker in the ceiling played, music so softly that she could only hear it during the gaps between customers, a piano, or maybe a guitar, something gentle and forgettable that existed only to fill the silence. Her line was long tonight. It was always long on Tuesdays, for reasons she had never understood. The people in it looked the way people look at the end of a day, tired, distracted, leaning on their carts, the way travelers lean on their luggage at an airport gate. They were not unkind. They were simply somewhere else, thinking about dinner, about traffic, about the phone call they needed to return, about the thing they forgot to buy that they would remember in the parking lot. She scanned their items, and she bagged their items, and she told them the total, and she said, "Have a good evening," and they said thanks, and they left. And the next person stepped forward, and the scanner beeped its flat note, and the line did not get shorter. She had been thinking, lately, about whether this mattered. Whether scanning groceries for 8 hours a day was a contribution to anything. Whether the world would notice if she stopped. She had wanted once to do something large with her life, something visible, something that people would point to and say, she made a difference. But the days had accumulated the way days do, quietly, without drama. And here she was, scanning a can of tomatoes for a man who was looking at his phone. And then the last person in line reached the register, an old woman, small and slow, with a basket instead of a cart. She placed her items on the belt one at a time: a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a bag of oranges, a tin of tea. She moved carefully, the way people move when their hands have begun to betray them. When the grip is not what it was, and the fingers do not always listen to the brain. The young cashier scanned the items: bread, beep; eggs, beep; oranges, beep; tea, beep. She bagged them and said the total, and the old woman paid with coins she had counted in advance, placed in a small cloth purse with a brass clasp. And then the old woman looked at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. "Thank you for smiling," the old woman said. The cashier blinked. "I was not," she started, and then stopped because she realized she had been smiling. Not deliberately. Not because the store required it. Just because the old woman had placed her items on the belt, so carefully, so slowly, with such precise attention, that something in the young woman had responded without being asked. The old woman put her coins back in the purse and closed the clasp with a small click. "You are the first person who has spoken to me today," she said. "Not spoken at me. Spoken to me. There is a difference." And you smiled. That matters more than you think. She picked up her bag and walked away, slowly, toward the automatic doors that opened with a sigh. The cashier watched her go. The line was empty now. The store was quiet. The piano played its soft, forgettable melody from the ceiling, and the young woman stood behind her register and thought about what the old Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said. Though she did not know his name or where the thought had come from, instead of criticizing, find out how to help. She had not been trying to help. She had only smiled, but the smile had been enough. The next person stepped forward. A man with a cart full of things. She scanned the first item. Beep. The same flat note. But she looked up at him, really looked, and said, "How is your evening going?" And he blinked, the way people blink when they are surprised by attention, and said, "It is going all right. Actually, thank you for asking." And she nodded and scanned the next item, and the beep sounded the same as it always had, but she heard it differently now. Not as a monotone, more like a heartbeat. Something steady and alive and quietly keeping time. How many times today did someone offer you a small kindness that you did not notice? A door held open 1 second longer than necessary. A voice that softened when it did not have to. A stranger who stepped aside on a narrow sidewalk so you could pass without adjusting your path. These are not grand gestures. They will not be remembered by anyone, least of all the person who offered them. But they are the fabric of a livable world, the thread that holds the whole thing together. So fine that you cannot see it, and so strong that everything falls apart without it. Sharon Salzberg, who has dedicated her life to the study and teaching of loving kindness, once observed that we find greater lightness and ease in our lives as we increasingly care for ourselves and other beings. Not dramatic care, not heroic care, just the steady, ordinary, unremarkable care of paying attention, of being present, of noticing that the person in front of you is a person, not an obstacle, not a task, not a means to an end, but a human being who is also tired, also trying, also carrying something you cannot see. On a morning in early autumn, when the first leaves had begun to change, but most of the trees were still holding on to summer, a man walked a route he had walked every working day for 31 years. He was a mailman. He carried a leather bag that had been new when he started, and was now soft and creased and dark with the oil of his hands, the strap worn thin across the shoulder, where it had rested through rain and heat, and the occasional snow. The bag was lighter today, not because there was less mail. There was always about the same amount. But because today was his last day, and something about knowing it was the last time made even the weight feel different. Gentler, more like a companion than a burden. The street was lined with houses. He knew the way you know the rooms of your own home. Not by thinking about them, but by feeling them. The way your feet know where the stairs end in the dark. He knew which gate squeaked. He knew which mailbox had the loose hinge. He knew that the house with the blue shutters had a dog that barked at everyone except him. Because he had spent the first 3 months of his route offering it a biscuit through the fence, until the dog decided he was not a threat, but a friend. The air smelled of morning, of dew on cut grass, and the first coolness that autumn brings, not cold yet, just a suggestion, a whisper from the season that is coming. Leaves crunched under his shoes in patches where they had already fallen, dry and brittle, and the color of rust. The sunlight was low and golden, coming in at the angle that makes everything look like a painting. The houses, the fences, the mailboxes with their small red flags, raised or lowered like signals from a life he had witnessed, but never fully entered. He had not thought of himself as someone who did something important. He delivered mail. He walked a route. He put paper into boxes. But over 31 years, he had done something else without meaning to. He had learned everyone's name. He knew that the woman at number 14 was expecting a letter from her son overseas. He knew that the couple at number 22 had just had a baby, and he left their mail tucked inside the screen door so they would not have to come outside. He knew that the old man at number 37 lived alone and checked the mailbox 3 times a day. Not because he expected anything, but because walking to the mailbox gave him a reason to stand in the sun. He did not call any of this kindness. He called it the job. He called it showing up. He called it paying attention, which was maybe the same thing. On this last morning, as he walked the route for the final time, something happened that he had not expected. At the first house, the woman came outside. She was holding a cup of coffee, and she said, "We are going to miss you." At the third house, a man he had only ever waved to was standing on the porch, and he shook the mailman's hand and said, "Thank you for always being careful with the packages." At the house with the blue shutters, the dog did not bark. It sat by the fence and watched him pass with its head tilted, as if it knew. By the time he reached the end of the street, there were people standing on porches and leaning out of doorways and waving from windows. Someone had brought a plate of cookies wrapped in foil. Someone else had written a card. A simple card with simple words that said, "You made this street feel like a neighborhood." He stood there, holding the card, the leather bag hanging from his shoulder, and he understood something he had not understood before. The kindness had not been small. It had never been small. It had only been quiet, and quiet things, given enough time, grow louder than anything. He set the bag down on the last porch step. The leather was warm from his body. The strap left a pale line on his shoulder, where the weight had rested for 31 years. The sun came through the trees and fell across his back, like a hand placed gently on his shoulder by someone he could not see but did not need to. Thich Nhat Hanh once said that awareness is like the sun. When it shines on things, they are transformed. Not changed into something they are not. Transformed into what they already are, seen clearly for the first time. The mailman's kindness did not need to be transformed. It only needed to be seen. And perhaps yours does too. Perhaps there are things you do every day, small, steady, unremarkable things that are already acts of kindness, already gifts, already the poem the Buddha wrote about, and you simply have not noticed because no one has told you, and you have not thought to tell yourself. Tonight, as you lie here, notice something. Notice that you are being held, not by hands, by whatever surface is beneath you, the bed, the couch, the floor, the seat of a car. Something is supporting the full weight of your body, without complaint, without condition, without asking anything in return. This is perhaps the quietest kindness of all, the kindness of being held by something that does not need to be thanked. Let yourself feel that holding. Let the weight of your legs be received. Let the weight of your back be received. Let the heaviness of your head, which has been carrying thoughts all day, so many thoughts, an entire day's worth of thoughts, let it rest now. Let it be received. You do not need to hold yourself up anymore. Something is already holding you. In the old language, the Buddha used the word dana to describe generosity, the act of giving. But dana does not only mean giving money, or food, or material things. Dana also means giving attention, giving time, giving presence. When the old woman thanked the cashier for smiling, she was naming a gift that the cashier did not know she had given. When the mailman remembered which family had a new baby and tucked the mail inside the screen door, that was dana. When you lie here tonight and listen, just listen, without needing to do anything with what you hear, that is also a kind of giving. You are giving your attention to something gentle, and in the giving, you are receiving. When you are ready, we will continue together. But what happens when kindness is asked to go somewhere it does not want to go? What happens when the heart is asked to open for someone who once closed it? That is a harder story, and it is the one we will explore next. What happens when kindness is asked to go somewhere it does not want to go? What happens when the heart is asked to open for someone who once closed it? Someone who hurt you, or dismissed you, or left a mark so deep that even the mention of their name changes the temperature inside your chest. This is the hardest part of tonight's teaching, and I want to be honest with you about that. I will not pretend it is easy. I will not pretend that a story can undo what years have built. But I will tell you what I have learned from the old teachings and from the people who live inside these stories, which is that kindness for the difficult person does not begin with the difficult person. It begins, as everything begins, with seeing clearly. Let us begin with a man and a workshop and the ghost of a voice that would not leave, in a town where the houses were built from local timber, and the smell of sawdust drifted through the streets on warm afternoons. There was a carpentry workshop that had belonged to the same family for 3 generations. It was not a grand place. The building was low and wide, with a corrugated roof that ticked and pinged when the rain came, and a large sliding door that was always half open because the ventilation was poor and the dust needed somewhere to go. The floor was packed earth, covered in a fine layer of shavings, pale curls of pine and oak, and sometimes cherry, when there was cherry to be had, which was not often. The light in the workshop came from 2 sources. There were the fluorescent tubes bolted to the rafters, which gave off a steady, clinical brightness that made everything look the same shade of grey-white. And there was the natural light that came through the open door and the single window on the west wall. And this light was different. In the late afternoon, it entered the workshop at a low angle and turned the sawdust in the air into something beautiful, like snow falling sideways each particle catching the gold and holding it for a moment before drifting down. The man who worked here sometimes stopped what he was doing just to watch this. He would not have called it meditation. He would have called it wasting time, but his hands would go still, and his eyes would follow the dust. And for a few seconds, the workshop was not a workshop, but a cathedral of tiny, floating, golden things. The man was in his late 40s. His hands were thick and calloused, the knuckles swollen from years of gripping tools that required force, and the hevels and mallets and the heavy iron plane that his father had used before him, and that still sat on the workbench, too dull to use properly, but too important to put away. The wood shavings stuck to his forearms where the sweat had dried. His fingertips were rough enough that he could run them along a planed surface and feel imperfections no one else could detect. A ridge, a grain running the wrong way, a place where the blade had caught and left a mark, so small that only touch could find it. He was working on a table, a simple table, 4 legs, a flat top, nothing decorative, the kind of table a family eats dinner on, and he was planing the surface, running the blade along the grain in long, slow strokes, each one lifting a thin ribbon of wood that curled and fell to the floor like a whisper made visible. But his hands were not steady today. They were doing the work. They always did the work. They knew the work better than his mind did. But behind them, in the place where intention lives, something was off, because today the blade had caught a small catch, barely visible. But he had felt it through his palms, the way you feel a wrong note in a song you know by heart. And when the blade caught, the voice came, not a real voice, not a sound in the room, but a voice all the same. His father's voice, clear and sharp, and carrying the particular disappointment of a man who believed that precision was a moral quality and that a mistake in the wood was a mistake in the character. You are not paying attention. That is your problem. You never pay attention. His father had been dead for 7 years. 7 years of silence from the man himself, and not a single day of silence from the voice he had left behind. It lived in the workshop, the way the smell of sawdust lived in the workshop, permanently, invisibly, woven into the air itself. Every time the blade caught, the voice spoke. Every time a joint was not quite flush, the voice spoke. Every time the man looked at his own work and felt the small, hot flicker of pride, the voice spoke over it, the way a hand covers a candle. He had tried not hearing it. He had tried arguing with it. He had tried agreeing with it. Yes, I am careless, yes. I am not good enough, yes, you were right, thinking that agreement might satisfy it. Nothing worked. The voice was not interested in resolution. It was interested in repetition. He ran the plane along the surface again. The blade moved smoothly this time. No catch. The wood was becoming what it was supposed to become, flat, even, warm to the touch. And as he worked, his hand found something in the grain. A mark. Not his mark, an older mark. A place where a different blade had passed, years ago, leaving a faint depression in the surface that had been sanded over, but never fully erased. His father's mark. His father had worked this piece of wood. Perhaps it had been part of something else once, a shelf, a frame, a practice piece, and had been repurposed, the way wood often is in a workshop where nothing is wasted. But the mark was there. The evidence of his father's hand, his father's blade, his father's afternoon in this same room, in this same light, with the same golden dust floating in the same low sun. He placed his palm flat on the mark, and for the first time, he did not hear the voice. he felt something else instead. He felt the cold of the workshop. The particular cold that comes through a corrugated roof in winter, that settles into your shoulders and your knuckles and makes the work harder than it needs to be. His father had stood here in this cold. His father's hands had been stiff in this cold. His father had gripped the plane with swollen knuckles and pushed the blade through grain that resisted. And the dust had risen around him in the same golden light, and he had been alone in this room, the way the sun was alone in this room now. And the son understood, not with his mind, but with his hand, with his palm pressed flat against the wood, that his father had also been afraid. Afraid of the catch, afraid of the imperfection, afraid of some voice inside him too. A voice that perhaps belonged to his father's father, or to the world that had told him that a man who makes mistakes is a man who is not enough. The criticism had not been cruelty, it had been fear, passed down like the iron plane, from hand to hand to hand. Pema Chodron, who has spent a lifetime helping people find tenderness in the hardest places, once wrote that if we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including the people who drive us crazy, can be our teacher. The carpenter did not know this teaching, but his hand on the wood knew it. His father had not been his enemy. His father had been another frightened man in a cold workshop, trying to make something straight, hearing a voice he could not silence, passing down the only thing he knew how to pass down, which was the demand for perfection that had been passed to him. The light shifted. The golden dust dimmed. The man lifted his hand from the mark and picked up the plane again and continued his work. The table would be finished by evening. It would not be perfect, but it would hold the weight of a family's dinner, and the dishes, and the elbows, and the conversations that happen over meals. And that was enough. That had always been enough. He did not forgive his father in that moment. Forgiveness is too large a word for what happened. But something loosened. Something that had been gripping opened by a fraction. The way a fist opens when you stop thinking about making a fist. There is a teaching, not from a sutta exactly, but from a poet who understood the inner landscape as well as any monk. Rumi once wrote that your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. The barriers, not the person, not the wrong they did, the barriers. The stories we tell ourselves about why this person does not deserve our kindness, why this situation is different, why this particular hurt is the exception to every rule about letting go. And when you look at those barriers honestly, not to tear them down, not to judge yourself for having built them, but simply to see them, you often find something unexpected behind them. You find that the barrier is not protecting you from the other person. It is protecting you from your own softness, from the vulnerability of caring about someone who hurt you, from the terrifying possibility that the person who caused your pain was not a monster but a human being who was afraid and did not know what to do with the fear. This does not excuse what they did. Nothing in these stories asks you to say that what happened was acceptable. It only asks you to see clearly, without flinching, that the difficult person is also a person, also afraid, also carrying a voice they cannot silence. A student once went to a meditation teacher and said, "I have been practicing metta for 3 years. I can send loving kindness to myself. I can send it to my friends, to strangers, even to animals. But I cannot send it to my father. When I try, the practice stops. The warmth disappears. I feel nothing but a wall." The teacher was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me, Before you began practicing metta, what did you feel when you thought of your father? Anger, the student said. Resentment. The wish that he had been different. And now? The teacher asked. After 3 years of practice? The student paused. The same, he said. Anger. Resentment. The wish that he had been different. The teacher smiled. So nothing has changed. The student thought about it. Then he said, something has changed. Before, the anger was all there was. Now, the anger is there, but I am there too. I can see the anger. I can hold it. I do not become it the way I used to. The teacher nodded. That is, metta for the difficult person, she said. It is not the absence of anger. It is the presence of something larger than the anger. Before practice, the anger fills the room. After practice, the anger is still in the room, but the room is bigger. And in the space around the anger, there is room for something else. Even if you do not have a name for it yet. In a hospital on the night shift, where the hallways are quieter than hallways are supposed to be, and the light has a quality that belongs to no particular hour. A nurse walked her rounds. She had been a nurse for 12 years. Long enough to know the difference between pain that asks for medicine and pain that asks for presence. Long enough to have learned that the body often says what the mouth will not. The hallway was long and dim. The floor was polished to a dull shine that reflected the blue-green glow of the monitors in the rooms she passed. Small screens, tracking heartbeats and oxygen levels, and the other numbers that measure a life from the outside. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, that clean, sharp, institutional smell that promises sterility but not comfort. Her shoes made no sound on the floor. She had learned to walk quietly years ago, the way someone learns any skill. Through repetition, through attention, through caring enough to change how you move through a space. There was one room she did not look forward to entering. Room 14. The patient in room 14 was a man in his 70s who was dying slowly and did not want to admit it. He was difficult. That was the word the other nurses used. Difficult. He complained about the food. He complained about the temperature. He rang the call button for reasons that seemed to have no reason. He spoke sharply, the way a person speaks when they believe that volume is the same as control. She had been assigned to his care for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of the sharp voice and the constant ringing and the look in his eyes that was not really anger. She had learned to see past that, but something else entirely. Something that looked like anger from the outside, but felt, when she stood close enough, like terror. Tonight, she entered room 14, expecting the usual, the complaint about the blanket, the demand for water that he would not drink, the sharp words that she had learned to let pass through her. The way wind passes through an open window, felt but not held. But tonight was different. Tonight the room was quiet. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The blue light played across the ceiling, and the man was awake, but he was not looking at her. He was looking at the window, where the parking lot lights made small orange circles on the glass. And his face was not angry. His face was the face of someone who has just realized something that cannot be undone. She came to the side of the bed. She checked the IV. She checked the monitor. She did the things her training told her to do. And then she did the thing her training had not taught her. She stood still. She waited. His hand moved, not toward the call button, toward her, slowly, the way hands move when they are asking for something they are afraid to ask for. His fingers were thin and dry, and the knuckles were swollen, and when they found her hand, they gripped it with a strength that surprised her. the strength of a man who is holding on to the only warm thing in a cold room. He did not say anything, neither did she. The monitor beeped. The blue light moved across the ceiling, and they stood like that for a long time. The difficult patient and the nurse, who had learned to see past the difficulty, hand in hand, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and clean sheets, and the particular quiet that comes when someone finally stops fighting. Sharon Salzberg once wrote that metta flows freely, like water poured from one vessel to another, taking the shape of each situation without changing its essence. The nurse did not change who the man was. She did not fix his fear. She did not make the dying easier or the night shorter. She simply held his hand, and the metta took the shape of that holding. And for a little while, the difficult person was not difficult at all. He was just a man, in a bed, in the dark, afraid. And she was just a woman, standing beside him, not afraid of his fear. His eyes closed eventually, his grip loosened, his breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, deep and even and trusting, the way children sleep when they know someone is watching over them. She stayed a few minutes longer, her hand in his, the monitor blinking its blue-green light like a small, steady star that had wandered indoors. Then she gently withdrew her hand, adjusted the blanket over his shoulders, and stepped back into the hallway, where the quiet closed around her, like water. Tonight, is there someone you have been keeping outside the walls of your kindness? Someone whose name you do not say, because saying it opens something you would rather keep closed. You do not need to let them in tonight. You do not need to forgive them or understand them, or even think about them clearly. You only need to notice the wall. That is all. Just notice that it is there, and perhaps notice your breathing. The breath that is coming in right now. You did not ask for it. It arrived on its own, the way kindness sometimes does. And the breath that is going out, it does not hold anything back. It does not say, I will breathe for this part of the body, but not for that part. It goes everywhere. It gives to everything equally, even to the places you would rather not feel. In the old language, there is a word for the opposite of ill will. It is abhyapada, where metta is the active wish. May you be well. May you be at peace. Abhyapada is the quieter side. It is simply the absence of the wish to harm, the decision to stop sending arrows, not to send flowers instead, just to put the bow down. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes metta for the difficult person does not look like love. It does not look like warmth or tenderness or a heart flung open. It looks like putting the bow down. It looks like choosing, just for tonight, not to replay the scene one more time, not to rehearse the argument, not to sharpen the words you never said, just to set it down, the way the carpenter set his hand on the wood and felt, instead of anger, the cold that his father had also felt. Abhyapada, non-ill will, the gentle refusal to add more pain to a world that already has enough. You do not need to remember the word, just the feeling of putting something down that you have been carrying and noticing that your arms are lighter and that the room is still the room and that nothing has been lost except the weight. When you are ready, we will continue together. And perhaps, in the end, there is no one to forgive and no one to be forgiven. Perhaps there is only this, the quiet recognition that we have never been as separate as we believed, that the walls between us are thinner than we thought, that the breath you are breathing right now is the same breath someone else is breathing, somewhere, in the dark on the other side of a wall you cannot see. Perhaps there is no one to forgive and no one to be forgiven. Perhaps there is only this, the quiet recognition that we have never been as separate as we believed, that the walls between us are thinner than we thought, and that somewhere, on the other side of every wall, someone else is lying awake, staring at a ceiling, carrying something they have not told anyone about. Tonight, we move from the single heart to the shared heart, from the question of how to be kind to one person, yourself, a stranger, a difficult person, to a larger question, a question the Buddha asked in a poem 2,500 years ago, and that the world has been answering one breath at a time ever since. The question is this: what if we are not separate at all? In a city where the buildings grew taller than the trees and the sky was something you saw in pieces. A strip of blue between rooftops, a rectangle of grey framed by a window. A young woman lived alone in a small apartment on the 4th floor. She had moved here 3 months ago from a town where everyone knew her name, and the bakery owner saved her a roll on Saturday mornings. And the woman at the post office asked about her mother. She had left that town for reasons that made sense on paper: a better job, a bigger life, a chance to become someone new. But the someone new turned out to be someone lonely, and the bigger life turned out to be a smaller room. The apartment was not unpleasant. It was clean. It had a window that faced west, which meant the light came in late and golden in the evenings, and if she pressed her face to the glass and looked down, she could see the street 4 floors below, taxis and bicycles, and people walking in patterns that seemed purposeful from a distance, but were probably just people going home. The kitchen was narrow enough that she could touch both walls with her arms outstretched, and the bathroom had a mirror with a crack in the upper corner that she kept meaning to report and kept forgetting about. But it was the window that she returned to every night, not the view down, the view across, because from her 4th floor window she could see into the windows of the building opposite, and the building beside that, and the building beyond that, stretching away in a grid of lit rectangles that went on farther than she could count. Hundreds of windows, hundreds of lives, behind each one a kitchen, a lamp, a person sitting alone or not alone, eating dinner or watching a screen, or reading or arguing or laughing or crying, or simply standing at their own window, looking out at her, looking out at them. She had never spoken to any of them. She did not know their names. She did not know whether the woman on the 3rd floor of the opposite building, who watered plants every evening, was happy or unhappy. She did not know whether the man on the 5th floor, who left his curtains open and paced the living room at midnight, was pacing because he was anxious, or because he was thinking, or because pacing was simply what his body did when the day was over, and the body had not yet received the message to stop. She knew nothing about any of them, and yet they were right there, close enough to see, close enough on quiet nights to almost hear. And the distance between her and them, the street, the air, the glass, the walls, felt enormous, felt like an ocean, felt like proof that you can be surrounded by 1,000,000 people and still be the loneliest person you know. And then, one evening in late summer, the power went out. It happened without warning. One moment, the apartment was lit, the kitchen light, the lamp by the bed, the small blue glow of the charging phone, and the next, everything was dark. Not just her apartment, the building, the street, the building across the street, the building beyond that. As far as she could see in every direction, the city had gone dark, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that it felt like the world had taken a breath and was holding it. She went to the window. The grid of lit rectangles was gone. In its place was a darkness that should have felt frightening, but did not, because it was shared. Everyone was in the same dark. Everyone was having the same moment. And into that darkness, slowly, came small points of light, candles, phone flashlights. The occasional match struck and held aloft like a tiny flag of surrender. And then she heard something she had never heard before from this window. Voices. Not the muffled, indistinct sounds that sometimes leaked through walls and floors, but real voices, clear and close. People were coming out, onto balconies, onto fire escapes, onto the small concrete ledges that passed for terraces in buildings like these. Someone on the floor below her said, "Does anyone have a candle?" And someone across the street called back, "I have 3. I will bring them over." And someone else laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and entirely without self-consciousness, and said, "I have been living here for 2 years, and I have never heard your voice before." Within minutes, the darkness had become a kind of neighborhood. People leaned over railings and introduced themselves. Someone brought bread and cheese down to the stoop and laid it out on newspaper. A man with a guitar played something slow and simple from a third-floor window, and the music drifted down the street like smoke. A child on a balcony held a flashlight under her chin and made shadow puppets on the wall of the building opposite, and strangers applauded. The young woman stood at her window and watched. And then she did something she had not done since moving to this city. She opened the window. She leaned out, and when the woman on the balcony below turned and looked up and said, "Hi, would you like some tea?" "I made too much." The young woman said yes, she would. Thich Nhat Hanh, who understood loneliness as well as he understood meditation, once wrote that we are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. The young woman had not read Thich Nhat Hanh. She did not know the word illusion or the word separateness in any philosophical sense, but she knew what it felt like to believe she was alone, and she knew what it felt like to discover that she was not. And the distance between those two feelings was exactly the width of an open window. The power came back an hour later. The fluorescent lights blinked on. The grid of lit rectangles returned, and the balconies emptied, and the doors closed, and the city resumed its familiar arrangement of walls and glass and private lives. But something had changed. Not in the buildings, in her. She knew now who lived below her, a woman named after a flower, who made tea too strong and laughed easily. She knew who lived across the street, a retired teacher who kept the curtains open because he liked the feeling of the city keeping him company. She knew that the child with the flashlight was afraid of the dark, which was why she turned it into a game. She went back to her window. The candle the woman downstairs had given her, a short, white candle in a glass jar, was still sitting on the windowsill. It had gone out when the power returned, but she did not throw it away. She left it there, on the sill, where she could see it. A reminder that the darkness had given her something the light never had. Tonight, wherever you are lying, in a house, in an apartment, in a room you share, or a room you do not, there are people nearby. You may not know their names, you may never have spoken to them, but they are there. Some of them are sleeping. Some of them are staring at their own ceiling, thinking their own thoughts, carrying their own weight. And between you and them, there is a wall, but the wall is thinner than you think. And on the other side of it, someone is breathing, just like you. Sharon Salzberg, who has taught loving kindness to thousands of people across decades, once wrote that metta is the ability to embrace all parts of ourselves, as well as all parts of the world. Not the parts we choose, not the parts that are easy, all parts, the neighbor we know and the neighbor we do not, the city that feels cold and the city that, in one dark hour, became warm. Metta does not require an open window, but it begins, perhaps, with the willingness to open one. There is a forest. You may have passed one like it, or dreamed one like it, or simply imagined one now. And in this forest, at night, everything breathes. Not just the obvious things. Not just the deer, and the owls, and the foxes moving through the undergrowth. Everything. The trees breathe, slowly, through pores in their leaves so small that no human eye can see them, taking in what we breathe out and breathing out what we breathe in. The moss breathes. The fungi beneath the soil breathe. The beetles and the worms and the small blind creatures that live their entire lives in 3 inches of earth. They breathe too, and none of them know about each other. The oak does not know the beetle. The beetle does not know the moss. The moss does not know the owl. They share the same air, the same darkness, the same quiet, but they do not know they are sharing it. They do not know that the breath of the oak is keeping the beetle alive, or that the decay of the beetle is feeding the roots of the oak, or that the whole forest, this immense, breathing, interconnected thing, exists only because every part of it is giving to every other part without being asked, and without expecting anything in return. The Buddha, in the Metta Sutta, spoke of whatever living beings there may be, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away. He did not say the worthy. He did not say the deserving. He said, whatever living beings there may be, all of them, the oak and the beetle and the moss and the blind thing in the soil, the neighbor you know and the stranger you do not. The forest breathes because everything in it breathes together. And perhaps the world is kind when it is kind for the same reason. In the countryside, where the land flattened out and the houses grew farther apart, and the sky took up most of the view, there lived a man who had been a doctor for 40 years. He had retired to a small house at the edge of a rice field, not because he loved farming, but because he loved the quiet, and because the field reminded him of something he had learned in all those years of medicine that no textbook had ever taught him. The field in late afternoon was a thing of extraordinary beauty. The rice was golden, not yellow, not brown, but the particular gold that grain turns when it has taken everything the sun and the rain and the soil have offered and has transformed it into something that will feed a family through winter. The stalks bent under the weight of the grain, leaning together the way old friends lean on each other. And when the wind came through, and it always came, a slow, warm wind from the west, the entire field moved as one. Every stalk, every head of grain, every blade of grass at the margins, all of them bending the same way at the same time, as if the field were not a collection of individual plants, but a single, vast breathing organism. He sat at the edge of the field, on a wooden bench he had built from scrap lumber. His hands rested on his knees, hands that had held hundreds of hands, that had delivered babies and closed wounds and pressed against chests in rooms where the only sound was the sound of someone not breathing. He had seen more pain than most people imagine. He had also seen more courage. And what he had learned, what the field reminded him of every evening, was that pain and courage looked the same in everyone. The king and the farmer cry the same tears when their child is sick. The rich woman and the poor woman grip the bedsheet the same way when the pain comes. The old soldier and the young student close their eyes the same way when they are afraid. He had looked into enough faces to know that behind every one of them was the same thing. Not the same story, not the same circumstance, but the same fragile, hopeful, terrified wish to be okay, to be safe, to be held, to not be alone. Shunryu Suzuki, the Zen master who helped bring Buddhism to the West, once observed that a flower falls, even though we love it, and a weed grows, even though we do not love it. In this way, he said, our life should be understood. The doctor understood this, not as philosophy, as medicine, as the daily practice of sitting with people who are falling and people who are growing and knowing that both deserve the same attention, both deserve the same care, both are part of the same field. He looked at the rice. The wind came again, and every stalk bent together, and the sound of it, a soft, rushing whisper, like 1,000 small voices saying the same word at the same time, filled the air around him. He did not know what the word was, but he knew what it felt like. It felt like belonging, like the opposite of loneliness, like the thing that happens when you stop seeing yourself as one stalk and start feeling yourself as part of the field. The sun touched the horizon. The gold deepened, and the old doctor sat on his bench with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the field and felt, without naming it, the thing that the Buddha had named 2,500 years ago. The boundless heart, the heart that does not separate, the heart that sees the field and knows it is not watching, it is part of what is being watched. You are breathing right now. You did not decide to breathe. The body did it for you. The way it has been doing it all day, all night, all your life, without once asking for permission or praise. And somewhere near you, in the next room, perhaps, or the next house, or the next building, or the next bed, someone else is breathing too. Their breath is not your breath, but the air is the same air. The oxygen you breathe out will be breathed in by someone else, a stranger, a neighbor, a plant on a windowsill, a tree in a park you have never visited, and the oxygen they breathe out will find its way, eventually, to you. This is not a metaphor. This is chemistry. This is the literal, measurable, scientific fact of being alive on a planet where everything shares the same air. And the old teachings have a word for this, paticca samuppada. It is a long word, and you do not need to remember it. It means dependent origination, the idea that nothing arises on its own, that everything that exists because of everything else. The rice grows because of the rain. The rain falls because of the ocean. The ocean moves because of the wind, and the wind that bends the field and moves the clouds and carries the breath from your lungs to the lungs of a stranger. The wind exists because the sun heats the earth unevenly, and the earth spins, and the spinning creates movement, and the movement becomes air, and the air becomes breath, and the breath becomes you, lying here tonight, listening to a story about a field of rice. You are not separate. You have never been separate. You only believed you were, the way the young woman in the apartment believed she was, until the lights went out and the darkness showed her what the light had hidden, that the world is full of people, and they are all right there, just on the other side of the glass. When you are ready, we will continue together. And what would happen if that kindness had no edge, no boundary, no wall, and no gate, and no list of who deserves it? What would happen if it simply went everywhere, the way light does, the way rain does, the way breath does. That is where we are going now. To the place where the heart has no walls at all. What would happen if kindness had no edge, no boundary, no wall and no gate, and no list of who deserves it and who does not? What would happen if it simply went everywhere? The way light does, the way rain does, the way the breath leaves your body and enters the world without asking where it is going. Let us rest here for a moment at the edge of this question before we step inside it. Take a breath. Let it out slowly. Feel the weight of your body, heavier now perhaps than it was an hour ago, heavier in the good way. The way a body gets heavy when it has been listening for a long time and has begun to trust the voice that is speaking and the stories that are being told. That heaviness is welcome. It means you are settling. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is something that the moon does every night that most of us never think about. It rises, it crosses the sky, and it shines. That is all. It does not choose what to illuminate. It does not shine more brightly on the garden and less brightly on the alley behind the grocery store. It does not skip the rooftop where the pigeons sleep or the bench where the man with nowhere to go has pulled his coat over his shoulders. It shines on the cathedral and the parking lot with equal tenderness. It shines on the ocean and the puddle in the same way. The moon has no opinion about what deserves its light. It simply shines. And the shining is enough. Rain is the same. It falls on the just and the unjust. That is not a Buddhist teaching, but it could be. Rain does not consult a list. It does not fall more gently on the flower and more harshly on the weed. It falls, and the earth receives it, and everything grows, the rose and the thistle, the wheat and the grass between the cracks in the sidewalk. The rain does not judge. It gives. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha offered a poem about this kind of giving, this giving without boundary. He said, "In gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease, whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none. Omitting none. Not the easy ones, not the ones who earned it, not the ones who asked for it. All beings, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and those waiting to be born. May all beings be at ease." This is the heart of the Metta Sutta, not a technique, not a practice exactly, a wish so large that it includes everything. And the question tonight is not whether you can feel this wish. That is too much to ask of anyone lying in the dark at the end of a long day. The question is simply whether you can imagine it. Whether you can imagine a heart with no walls at all. At a bus stop on the edge of a city, at 5 o'clock in the morning, a woman sat on a metal bench and waited. The bench was cold. She could feel it through her coat, through the thin fabric of the work pants she wore underneath. A deep, patient cold that had been accumulating all night and would not leave until the sun had been up for hours. Her hands were wrapped around a paper cup of coffee from the gas station across the street. The coffee was not good. It was thin and slightly burned, and it cost more than she wanted to spend. But it was warm, and the warmth moved from the cup into her palms, and from her palms into the place behind her ribs where the tiredness lived. And for the moment, that was enough. The sky was still dark, not the full dark of midnight, but the grudging, thinning dark of a morning that is coming, but has not yet committed. The streetlights were still on, orange and buzzing, casting circles of dim light on the sidewalk that made the darkness between them seem darker. She could see her breath. Each exhale was a small cloud that hung in front of her face for a moment, and then dissolved like a thought that had not quite formed. She had been awake since 4. She had made breakfast for her son. Scrambled eggs and toast, his lunch packed in a bag with his name on it, written in marker that she had to rewrite every few weeks because the letters faded. She had walked him to the neighbor's apartment, where he would sleep for another hour. Before the neighbor walked him to school, she had kissed the top of his head, which smelled of shampoo and sleep and something else, something that was just him, just the particular scent of her particular child, which she could have found in a room full of children, with her eyes closed. And now she was here, at the bus stop, in the cold, going to the first of 2 jobs, the morning one at the warehouse, the afternoon one at the hotel. She would not be home until 8 tonight. By then, her son would have done his homework at the neighbor's table and eaten dinner and perhaps already be asleep. She would stand in his doorway and watch him breathe for a minute. That was her favorite minute of the day. The one she worked the other 1,439 minutes to earn. And then she would eat whatever was in the refrigerator and set her alarm and do it again. She was tired in a way that went past the body. It was in the mind, in the heart, in the place where the reasons live. She had enough love for her son, more than enough, an inexhaustible supply that renewed itself every time she saw his face. But for everyone else, the tank was empty. She had nothing left for the coworker who complained about the schedule. Nothing for the manager who never remembered her name. Nothing for the woman at the hotel front desk who spoke to her as if she were furniture. She had pulled the walls of her heart tight around the one person who mattered, and everyone else was outside, and she did not have the energy to care about that. The bus came. She climbed the steps, paid the fare, found a seat near the back. The bus was not crowded. Not yet. Not at this hour. But it was not empty either. There were maybe a dozen people, scattered across the rows, each one a small island of exhaustion. A man in a reflective vest sat across the aisle, with his head back and his eyes closed, his hard hat resting on his lap like a bowl. A young woman in scrubs sat near the front, scrolling through her phone, with the particular intensity of someone reading a message she did not want to read. An old woman near the middle sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window, watching the dark streets pass without expression. The bus moved. The city scrolled past the windows. Closed shops, empty sidewalks, a dog trotting along a fence line with somewhere to be, and the mother sat in her seat and looked at these people, these strangers, these fellow passengers on the I-15. And something happened that she did not plan and could not have predicted. She saw herself, not literally, not in a mirror, but in them. In the man with the hard hat, who was going somewhere difficult because someone depended on him. In the woman in scrubs who had probably worked all night and was heading home to sleep for a few hours before doing it again. In the old woman by the window who was up at 5 in the morning for reasons that were her own and that probably involved someone she loved or had lost. They were all doing the same thing. Every one of them. They were all getting on a bus in the dark because they had to. Because there was someone or something on the other side of the day that required them to show up. They were all tired. They were all carrying something, and not one of them had asked to be seen. But she saw them, and in the seeing, the walls she had built, the tight, necessary, exhaustion-built walls around her heart, did not collapse. They did not need to. They simply became transparent. She could still feel them. But she could also feel through them. And what she felt was not compassion exactly, and not love exactly, but something simpler. Recognition. The recognition that the man in the hard hat and the woman in scrubs and the old woman by the window were all her. Not metaphorically, literally. They were all doing the same thing with the same body on the same dark morning. And the only difference between them was the name on the lunchbox and the face they kissed goodbye. Metta did not expand because she got stronger. It expanded because she got tired enough to stop holding the walls up. And when the walls became transparent, she did not lose anything. She did not have less love for her son. She simply had a larger room, and in that room, there was space for the hard hat and the scrubs and the still hands by the window. The bus stopped. She gathered her bag and stood and walked to the door. As she stepped down onto the sidewalk, she looked back through the window at the people still sitting in the warm light of the bus. And she did not know their names, and she would probably never see them again. But she wished them well, not with words, not with effort, just with the quiet, unforced recognition that they were in this together, all of them, the whole 515, and that the morning would come for all of them, and that the morning was already coming now. A thin line of pale light at the edge of the sky that was not yet sunrise, but was the promise of one. Sharon Salzberg once wrote that to reteach a thing its loveliness is the nature of metta. Through loving kindness, everyone and everything can flower again from within. The mother at the bus stop did not need to learn loveliness. She needed to see it in the hard hat, in the scrubs, in the folded hands. Metta is not a skill you acquire. It is a sight you recover. A way of seeing that was always there, buried under the reasonable, necessary, exhaustion-built belief that you do not have enough to go around. You do. You always did. Not because you are strong, because you are not separate. In a small meditation hall at the edge of a town, a practitioner sat alone. The hall was simple, a wooden floor, bare walls, a single window that looked out onto a courtyard where a plum tree grew. It was late, past midnight, and the last sitting of the day was ending. The candle on the altar had burned low, and the flame was doing what flames do near the end, flickering irregularly, casting long shadows that moved across the walls like slow, silent visitors. The air smelled of incense, not the heavy, sweet incense of ceremony, but a lighter kind, sandalwood mixed with something herbal, that left a thin haze in the air and a warmth in the throat. The floor was smooth under his knees, worn by decades of other knees in other seasons, and the warmth of the wood surprised him, as it always did. As if the floor remembered all the bodies that had sat here and held their heat. Outside, the crickets sang, not the single-note cricket of summer, but the full, layered, overlapping chorus of early autumn. Dozens of voices, each slightly different in pitch and rhythm, weaving together into a sound that was not music exactly, but was not noise either. It was the sound of the world continuing without him, the sound of things being alive, whether or not anyone was paying attention. He had been practicing metta meditation for many years, the traditional form, the one the Buddha had taught, the one that had been passed down through centuries of teachers and students, and quiet rooms like this one moved in circles. You begin at the center. You send loving kindness to yourself. May I be well. May I be safe. May I be at ease. And then you widen the circle. To someone you love, may you be well. To a friend, to a neutral person, someone you neither like nor dislike, the cashier at the store, the person who delivers the mail, may you be well. And then, and this is the hard part the part that takes years and sometimes never fully arrives. You widen the circle further, to the difficult person, to the one whose name tightens your jaw. May you be well. And then, finally, to all beings, everywhere, without exception, without boundary. Tonight, he had moved through the circle slowly. Himself, his mother, who was old and far away, a friend he had not spoken to in months, the woman who owned the shop across the street, whose name he knew, but whose life he did not. And then, the difficult one. A person from years ago, a person whose face still appeared when the mind was quiet enough to let old things surface. He stayed with this one for a long time, not forcing the warmth, just allowing the space to exist, just saying the words and letting them fall where they fell, the way seeds fall, some on stone, some on soil, and you do not get to choose which. And then he opened the circle. All beings, whatever living beings there may be, the seen and the unseen, the near and the far, the born and the not yet born. He did not try to picture them. That would be impossible. And the trying would be the opposite of what the practice asks. He simply let the wish go. Let it expand without directing it. Let it become like the breath, going out, going everywhere, landing where it lands. Pema Chodron, who has written with such clarity about the inner life, once observed that war and peace start in the human heart. Whether that heart is open or whether that heart closes has global implications. He did not think of this quote as he sat there. He thought of nothing, or as close to nothing as thinking allows. But the truth of it was in the room. The truth of it was in the candle, and the incense, and the crickets, and the worn floor, and the plum tree outside the window that would bloom in spring, whether or not anyone was here to see it. He opened his eyes. He stood slowly, his knees speaking to him in the language they always spoke after a long sit, which was the language of patience and time, and the cost of devotion. He walked to the door, and he opened it. The night was there. The full, wide, unhurried night, with its stars and its cold air, and its silence. That was not really silence, but the breathing of everything that was alive within it. The moon was up, 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough to turn the courtyard stones silver, and the moonlight came through the open door and entered the meditation hall and fell across the floor where he had been sitting. And it did not ask who had been sitting there or whether they were worthy of its light. It simply shone, the way it shines on everything, without preference, without condition, without walls. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The incense smoke drifted past him and out into the night air, where it thinned and rose and disappeared into the dark. The crickets sang. The plum tree held its bare branches up to the sky like open hands, and the practitioner stood at the edge between inside and outside, between the small warm room and the boundless night, and he understood. Not with his mind, but with his whole body, with his knees and his breath, and the soles of his feet on the warm wood floor, that there was no edge. There had never been an edge. The room and the night were the same room. The candle and the moon were the same light. The heart and the world were the same heart. And the door was open. Tonight, your heart does not need to go anywhere. It does not need to reach across oceans or include every living being by name. It does not need to become something it is not. It only needs to do what it is already doing, which is to beat, to continue, to send the blood through the body the way the moon sends light through the dark, without choosing, without excluding, without stopping to ask whether it should. And perhaps tonight, just for a moment, You can let the breath go out without holding it back, without directing it, without saying, "This breath is for me and this one is for my family, and that is all I have." Let it go the way the incense goes, out the door, into the night, into the air that everyone shares. In the old language, the word for this is apamanga. It means boundless, immeasurable, without limit. Metta apamana, a heart without walls. Not because the walls have been destroyed, not because you tore them down in some dramatic act of courage, but because you opened the door and the moonlight came in and you realized that the walls were never as solid as you thought. They were made of fear, and fear, like incense smoke, thins when you stop feeding it. It rises, it fades, and what is left is the room, the full, warm, boundless room of your own heart. You do not need to remember the word, just the feeling of a door opening, the feeling of light coming in that did not ask permission, the feeling of the night outside and the warmth inside being, in the end, the same thing. When you are ready, we will continue together. We have traveled a long way tonight, through stillness and self-compassion, through forgiveness and small kindnesses, through the difficult and the boundless. And there is one more story I would like to share with you before we rest. The simplest one of all. A story about a woman who never learned the word metta and who never needed to. We have come to the end of our journey tonight. And what a journey it has been. We began with a restless heart, a seamstress sitting alone in lamplight, a monk on a hill with a mind that would not settle. And we discovered that kindness does not ask the mind to be silent. It only asks the mind to be met with warmth, with patience, with the same gentleness you might offer a child who cannot sleep. We turned inward, and we sat on a kitchen floor with a woman who had given everything to everyone, and had never once said to herself, "It is all right." We knelt in a garden with a man whose hands had learned to be gentle with roses long before they learned to be gentle with himself. And we found that the oldest teaching about love begins not with others, but with the one person we most often forget. We carried the weight of resentment to a rocky shore, and we watched an old fisherman pull seaweed from a fish and set it free. We sat at a desk in the rain and wrote a letter that would never be sent, and we felt what it is like to put something down after carrying it for years. We looked for kindness in small places, in a grocery store, on a mail route, and we found it there, steady and unremarkable, and holding the whole world together like thread. We opened the door to the difficult person, the father whose voice would not leave, the patient who was afraid, and we learned that metta for the one who hurt us does not require us to forgive. It only requires us to see that behind the anger there is almost always fear. And fear, like ours, deserves to be met with something softer than more fear. We discovered that we have never been as separate as we believed. That the breath you breathe out becomes the breath someone else breathes in. That the field bends as one. That the forest lives because everything in it lives together. And we stood at the door of a meditation hall and felt the moonlight come in and understood that the heart, when it stops trying to protect itself, is already boundless, already full, already shining on everything, the way the moon shines on everything, without choosing, without excluding, without stopping to ask who is worthy of its light. These are not lessons, they never were. They are invitations, invitations to rest inside something ancient and warm and true, something that was here before you arrived tonight and will be here after you have fallen asleep. And now, before we close, there is one more story, the simplest one, about a woman who never learned the word metta and never needed to. At the end of a dirt road, in a part of the countryside where the nearest town was a 40-minute walk and the nearest bus stop was twice, that there stood a small house. It was not a beautiful house, not by any standard that the world uses to judge beauty. The walls were plaster over stone, patched in places where the weather had found its way through. The roof was tin, rusted at the edges, and when it rained the sound inside was so loud that conversation became impossible, which the woman who lived there did not mind, because she had learned long ago that silence and noise are both forms of company. The house had 3 rooms, a kitchen that was also the living room, with a wood-burning stove against one wall, and a table with 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a small yard where nothing grew in winter except the memory of what had grown in summer. A bedroom with a narrow bed and a quilt her mother had made from scraps of dresses that no longer fit anyone, and a small room by the front door that had once been a pantry and now held boots and coats and an umbrella that had not worked in years, but that she kept because throwing things away felt like a kind of rudeness to the objects that had served her. She was old, not dramatically old, not ancient or fragile, or any of the words people use when they want to make age sound like a disease. She was simply old the way a tree is old, thickened by time, shaped by wind, more root than branch. Her hands were small and strong, and the skin on them was thin enough that you could see the veins beneath, blue-green rivers running just under the surface, carrying the blood that had been carrying her for nearly 8 decades. The stove was lit tonight. It was always lit in winter. She fed it in the morning, and again at noon, and again at dusk. And the wood she used was pine, mostly, because pine was what grew on the hill behind the house, and because she liked the smell of it. Pine and smoke, and the dry, resinous warmth that filled the kitchen and crept into the bedroom, and even into the small room by the door, so that the whole house smelled like a forest that had decided to come inside and sit down. On the stove, a pot of rice porridge simmered. She made this most evenings, a simple porridge, thick and plain, with a little salt and sometimes a handful of dried mushrooms if she had them. She made more than she could eat. She always made more than she could eat. Not by accident, by habit, by the same instinct that made the spider spin a web larger than it needed, because the making was the point, and the extra was for whoever came. And people came, not every night, but often enough. The man who farmed the adjacent field and whose wife was sick this winter. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she left the pot on the stove with a bowl beside it, and a spoon resting on the bowl, and he let himself in without knocking, because she had told him years ago that her door did not need knocking on. The young mother from the house down the road, who was raising 3 children alone, and who sometimes stood in the doorway, looking so tired that the old woman did not say, "Come in." She simply took the woman's coat and hung it up, and pushed her gently toward the chair by the stove, and ladled the porridge into a bowl, and sat across from her, and said nothing at all, because sometimes nothing is the most generous thing a person can say. There was a cat. There had always been a cat, though not always the same one. The current cat was grey and thin, and had appeared on her doorstep one morning 2 winters ago, wet and shaking and looking at her with the particular expression of an animal that has decided, without evidence, to trust a stranger. She had opened the door. The cat had walked in, and that was that. It slept beneath her chair in the evenings, curled into a shape that seemed to defy the anatomy of cats, a perfect circle of grey fur and slow breathing, and it purred when the stove was hot and was silent when it was not. As if the purring were powered by the same fire. She knew every child in the village by name. Not just their names, but their preferences. Who liked their porridge sweet, who wanted extra salt, who was afraid of the dark, and who pretended not to be. When the children walked past her house on the way to school, she stood at the window and waved, and they waved back. And this exchange, this small, daily, entirely unremarkable greeting, was the thread that connected her to the world. She did not need a thicker thread. This one held. Every evening, without fail, she lit a lamp on the front porch, not a large lamp. A small oil lamp, the kind that burns for hours on a few tablespoons of fuel. She placed it on the railing where it could be seen from the road, and it cast a small circle of warm light into the darkness. Not enough to illuminate anything, not enough to read by or work by, but enough to say someone is here, someone is awake. If you are walking this road in the dark, you are not walking it alone. She did not know why she did this. If you had asked her, she would have said, because the road is dark. She would not have said, because I believe in the interconnectedness of all beings. She would not have said, because the Buddha taught that loving kindness should be extended to all creatures without exception. She would not have said any of these things, because she had never heard of the Buddha, and did not know the word metta, and had never sat in a meditation hall, or read a poem about kindness, or attended a single lecture on compassion. She simply lit the lamp, and left the door unlocked, and made more porridge than she could eat, and waved at the children, and sat with the grieving, and let the cat in. Tonight was a quiet night. No one had come. The porridge simmered on the stove, and the lamp burned on the porch, and the cat slept beneath the chair, and outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Not heavily, gently. Flakes so small and so light that they seemed to hang in the air rather than fall through it, turning and drifting and catching the lamplight as they passed the window. Small, golden, weightless things. Each one different from every other. Each one arriving exactly where it was supposed to arrive. She watched the snow for a long time. She did not think about kindness. She did not think about love. She did not think about the farmer, or the young mother, or the children, or the cat, or the lamp on the porch. She did not think in words at all. She felt the warmth of the stove at her back, and the weight of the quilt across her lap, and the presence of the cat at her feet, and the quiet of the house, and the snow outside, and the lamp still burning on the porch, and the road beyond the lamp where someone might be walking or might not be walking, but where the light would be waiting either way. And she felt, not as a thought, but as a warmth, as a fullness, as something that lived in the chest and spread outward the way the heat from the stove spread outward, that tonight everyone was warm, not because she had made them warm, not because she had done something extraordinary, but because she had done the ordinary things, the porridge, the lamp, the open door, and the ordinary things had accumulated over the years the way snow accumulates, flake by flake, until the whole landscape is changed, and you cannot point to any single flake and say, that was the one that made the difference. Her eyes grew heavy. The fire crackled softly. The cat purred its low, rumbling, stove-powered purr, and the old woman leaned back in her chair, and her breathing slowed, and the snow continued to fall outside the window in its silent, unhurried, boundless way, and she slept. She slept the way a person sleeps who has spent a lifetime, leaving the door open. Deeply, easily, with a heart so full that there was no room left for worry, with a lamp still burning on the porch for whoever might need it. If this brought you some peace tonight, you are welcome to subscribe for more long-form audio like this, and share it with anyone who could use a slower night. Original commentary, stories, and script, written and produced by Moonlit Dharma. Thank you for joining us here at Moonlit Dharma. And now, let us rest. Perhaps you notice that your shoulders have already begun to drop. Just slightly, just enough. They have been holding something all day. The weight of tasks, of decisions, of the invisible effort of being upright in a world that asks so much of the body. But you are not upright now. You are lying down, and the shoulders do not need to hold anything anymore. Let them soften. Not because you are telling them to, because they already want to. Perhaps the jaw has loosened too. The jaw carries more than we know. The words we said, and the words we swallowed, and the tension of keeping the mouth closed when it wanted to speak. Let it soften now. Let the teeth part slightly. Let the tongue rest at the bottom of the mouth, heavy and still. The hands, wherever they are, resting on your chest, lying beside you, curled loosely on the blanket. They have done so much today. Held things, typed things, opened things, carried things. Let them be empty now. Let them be still. Let the fingers uncurl, one by one, like petals opening in slow motion, until the palms are soft and the hands are open and there is nothing left to grip. The breath continues. It has been continuing all along, without your help, without your instruction. Let it continue. Let the chest rise and fall the way the surface of a lake rises and falls when the wind is gentle and the water has nothing to prove. You do not need to breathe deeply. You do not need to breathe slowly. Just let the breath be, whatever the breath wants to be. It has been doing this work your whole life. It knows how. And the weight, the full weight of your body, not the emotional weight that has been softening all evening, story by story, breath by breath. The physical weight, the simple, beautiful, animal heaviness of bones and muscle and skin. Let it rest. Let it be received by whatever is beneath you, the bed, the blanket, the floor. Let yourself be held the way the snow is held by the ground, gently, completely, without question. Your body has been listening to these stories too, and it has already begun its own quiet journey toward rest. The same warmth that lived in the old woman's kitchen lives in you right now, in the chest, in the belly, in the slow, easy pulse of blood through the veins. You do not need to create it. It was already here. It has always been here. The warmth is not something you do. It is something you are, and the night goes on, the way nights do, quietly, without hurry, without needing to arrive anywhere. The stories we have shared tonight are settling now, the way snow settles. Each one finding its place, each one adding to something larger than itself. You do not need to remember them. They will remember themselves, the way a song remembers itself, even when no one is singing it. They will be there in the morning, or they will not, and either way, they have already done what they came to do. The river is still flowing somewhere, past the stones. It has been smoothing for 1,000 years. The field is still bending in the wind, every stalk leaning the same direction. The old woman's lamp is still burning on the porch, a small gold point in the darkness, waiting for whoever might need it. And you are here, in the dark, in the quiet, in the warmth. The Metta Sutta, that ancient poem about kindness that the Buddha gave to a group of frightened monks in the dark forest, ends with a simple instruction. It says, one should sustain this recollection, not this understanding, not this analysis, this recollection, this remembering, as if kindness is not something you learn, but something you remember, something you always knew. The way the body knows how to breathe, the way water knows how to flow downhill, the way a door knows how to open when the wind finds it unlatched. Tonight, you have remembered, and now the night is yours. The stories are finished. The teaching has been given, not by me, but by the seamstress, and the monk, and the fisherman, and the teacher, and the cashier, and the mailman, and the carpenter, and the nurse, and the mother on the bus, and the old woman with the lamp. They gave it to you the only way it can be given. Not as instruction, but as presence. Not as a lesson, but as a light, left burning for whoever might need it. When you are ready, and there is no hurry, there has never been any hurry. Let your eyes close. Let the last image in your mind be whatever it wants to be. The snow falling, the lamp burning, the moonlight through an open door, the old woman sleeping by the fire with a heart so full that it could warm the whole road. May you be well tonight. May you be safe. May you be at ease. And may you sleep deeply, gently, completely, with a heart full of kindness that you did not have to earn, because it was yours all along. It was always yours, from the very beginning. The night holds you now, and the night is kind.